Ladies and gentlemen, in just a moment, the man you see in front of you is going to be teaching you to speak in tongues and being a little bossy. So, yeah, typical day at church. That's what's happening in just a moment, I think. Stay tuned.
Well, good evening again. I'm Bob Greaves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. Good to be back with you again tonight. And tonight, as Joey told you, I'm going to be talking to you about speaking in tongues. And I actually didn't know if what I was going to have to say would actually take up the whole time. So I thought I'd begin a new topic that I will no doubt continue on maybe for a couple of shows, talking about authority in the church. And truth be told, I'll be trying to be talking about both of those topics in a way where I approach it in a way I'm thinking outside of the box. Now, a lot of people have heard that phrase, thinking outside of the box, but a lot of people don't know always how to do that. So I'll even try and share with you a little bit about how to think outside of the box. If we were trying to talk about a particular problem that we were having, and we wanted to, thank you, and we wanted to define our problem and then try to solve the problem and understand what that problem is. We're never thinking outside of the box, even if we're trying to find solutions to that problem that are unusual, off the beaten path. Thinking outside of the box really involves reinventing an understanding of the problem. Let's go back to the way we define the problem and ask ourselves, are we even defining the problem correctly? And when it comes to tongues, I find that there's a lot of controversy concerning tongues that I find I'm not so sure I'm hopping onto any one of those particular notions that tend to exist. The controversy of tongues is something that became much more central in the church after the Pentecostal movement became a little more mainstream. Because the truth is, for years, church didn't even really think about that as one of the so-called gifts. And as a result, it just wasn't really a practice in the church much. And if it was being practiced anywhere, it was obscure enough that it just wasn't a central issue. But as soon as Pentecostalism became mainstream, then when the charismatic movement happened, it was also a very strong part of the charismatic movement. But prior to that, historically, the church didn't really deal with it much. In fact, it was kind of the typical position of the church to look at it and just understand it as something xenoglossic, which is meaning the church tended to perceive tongues as something for the apostolic age, whereby the apostles and some of the other missionaries, which, by the way, that's really what apostle means. Somebody kind of sent out, where in that apostolic age, it was important to get the gospel out. And they had to get the gospel out to various different places that, have missionaries trained in that language. And so it was thought that people were able, through the gift of the Holy Spirit, to just speak in languages they hadn't really ever learned. And that was just assumed. We don't really have anything outside of the book of Acts to corroborate the idea that anything like that ever happened. In fact, oddly enough, in the book of Acts, when Peter comes out and speaks about all this commotion that was going on, the actual phenomenon, as at least is reported in the text of the Bible, is actually a little different than the typical way that tongues is understood. It's not claimed there that anyone was speaking in languages they hadn't learned, but rather that they were speaking in their own language and people were hearing it in their own tongue. That's unusual. That's probably the only time we see, even in the text of the Bible, that such a notion is claimed. So other times of speaking in tongues don't really involve that. They involve a speaker who's speaking something that is apparently not a traditional language. Now, it's important to also recognize that when looking at this, that as we're looking at it out of the box, we want to recognize that we're using words that get used in ways we don't normally think of them. And so, the going back to this idea before I finish or go back to the issue of tongues, how do you think outside of the box? Ask yourself, am I defining the problem in a too traditional a manner? Maybe it's not really the problem we have. You see, the problem is this, that many times we perceive our problems to exist in some place. And this is the sense of when we call, we need to grease the squeaky wheel. Well, it may not be the squeaky wheel that's the real problem. It could be the bent axle. And the wheel's really just fine. It's only squeaking because of the tension it's under with the axle being bent. And so fixing the squeaky wheel by greasing it up is really just masking the problem. And very often, this is the way problems are solved. Our initial response is to just assume that we're irritated enough by the problem that we know what the problem is. We just need a solution now. And the problem with that is that we end up trying various solutions, many that will probably only make things worse, none that'll ever really work, because we're trying to solve a problem we don't really have. The problem hasn't been properly defined and properly understood and probably established as the problem. And this is also true even in our modern world, where although I think we've got some pretty good rubrics for problem solving, and we've developed a variety of techniques and approaches that are helpful. That's good, but we don't always do this. In fact, one of my favorite things to criticize. Don't get me wrong, I really do believe in psychology as a legitimate science. I believe in I believe in the research and the various things that we're learning and understanding about cognitive processes and emotion and stuff like that. But I really see also the world of psychology as filled with a little bit of its own socio-political biases and its own kind of religion. One of my favorite things is to go through the diagnostic and statistical manual and look at the definitions of the various different disorders and ask myself questions. Who defined this disorder? And very often it becomes kind of obvious that depending on what the disorder is, most disorders are really talked about from the standpoint of the person most irritated by the problem. So that some disorders are spoken of from the standpoint of the person apparently suffering the disorder. Some disorders are talked about from the standpoint of people who are suffering from the person who apparently has the disorder. And one of them that I think is interesting is the ADHD concept of the hyperactive individual who just doesn't seem to have enough attention. This is a disorder which is oftentimes spoken from the perspective of, believe it or not, the school teacher, who can't seem to keep the student focused on the lesson they have prepared. And the student doesn't seem to be able to pay attention. And by working with this, we've actually totally misdefined the dynamic of what's really going on with the people supposedly suffering from attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity or without hyperactivity, to the point where we're really discussing what they are going through in terms of how it gets in the way of people who want them to pay attention. Instead of recognizing that actually, when we look at it from the standpoint of the person who is experiencing what we call the disorder, they're often really experiencing an effulgence of attention. They're not having any problem paying attention to everything. They just can't narrow their attention down for whatever reasons on a single thing, like the teacher's lesson. So it's not that they're suffering from an attention deficit. There is actually experiencing attention effulgence. Anyway, that's another issue. But by thinking outside of the box, you begin to define and look at problems in a very different way. And this perhaps is even part of how I ended up being so unconventional. It's not that I'm trying to be unconventional. It's that part of my natural mode of thinking, I guess, has become that which I question the box we're defining our problems in before I even get started. And I oftentimes discover that I'm not so sure that the case has been made that the problem as we define it is indeed the problem or even a problem. And so anyhow, so we get back to this issue of tongues. And many times we hear people talking about it as a gift of the Holy Spirit. And what is tongues? Well, this all depends on, I guess, who you talk to. But many people are people who will actually claim that tongues is a gift of the Holy Spirit, whereby the person then is able to pray or speak out to other people in a language they never learned as a gift of the Holy Spirit. And that if they pray in this way, their prayers are actually being heard by God, even though not necessarily heard by themselves. And that this is something supernatural. Now, I think it's important to notice this, that when you look at the biblical text, nowhere does the biblical text claim that this concept of tongues has anything to do with anything supernatural, except in that book of Acts, where the gift is really people hearing in a different tongue than what was being spoken. It's also, I think, important to realize that the word translated as tongue is the word that was also used in that language merely to refer to a language. And more than just that, also used of vocative expression. Now, Joey was a little bit right about about when he told you that by the end of tonight, I bet you I could get some of you speaking in tongues who never ever thought of speaking in tongues. Let me be a little honest with you. And this is going to be, to some of you, a little bit weird. I don't believe that tongues is anything supernatural at all. And in my own privacy, many times I speak in tongues. But I understand it to be something very, very different than what is usually typically talked about. And so let me explain to you a little bit about that, and we'll redefine this issue and try to understand what's going on. It's good to know, if you're going to be honest about it, that Christianity is not the only religion that is ever claimed to, for spiritual purposes or for transcending purposes, to speak in tongues. There's some evidence that the Native American Indians, some of them had various rituals where they would do, engage in a behavior that was pretty essentially the same thing as speaking in tongues, although I don't think they used that phrase. We find that in China and in India, in the ancient world, that there were many people who would engage in this as a part of their spiritual activities. In fact, it was not common. People who would walk on coals would speak in tongues as they're walking on coals. I think you can understand the motivation. But not all of those cultures would have necessarily perceived it as something supernatural or unusual. Now, we have had linguists, people who study language, take a look at recordings and that they could take and study of both numerous examples of people not only speaking in tongues, but also of then interpretations being offered. And there are several observations. I think there was a book actually written in the 70s by some Canadian linguist. I can't recall who he was, but I remember hearing about that. Anyhow, what linguists have discovered is this. Every single language known to us possesses certain structural elements. There is no language we know of that does not possess a certain degree of structural elements, although the way each language is structured can be completely different and in many ways totally arbitrary. They all have structures. I mean, for example, in English, when we form the past tense of something like write, it goes to wrote. There are other verbs that we have that when we speak them, the past tense goes to that O sound, like I speak and then I spoke. Past tense involves going to the O sound. There are not all verbs, but there are many verbs that do that. And that's a structure in our language that is regularly followed. There are other structures we have for past tense. For example, adding ed to the end of, you might go out on a date. You may have dated. Um, we use various different verbs and form the past tense by adding ed. What's interesting to note is in English that sometimes we pronounced the ed very much as in ed. Sometimes it's more like a t, et, and sometimes it's kind of like a th. So that even though we use ed on many verbs to form the past tense, the way we pronounce the ed is a little different for different verbs based upon the consonants and vowels that precede it. And what's interesting to note is this, that little children learning the language will learn to make the proper ed, et, or eth for the past tense naturally without ever really being taught. And it's believed that part of the reason for that is that there's certain natural modifications that roll off the tongue given the sort of um, uh, morphology or shapes of sounds that we tend to use in our language, that this becomes a more natural modification in order to allow the language flux, the flow of what's coming out of the mouth to work. And so what linguists have noted is that every language has these structures to it that help us to begin, even if we don't know the language, we can begin to identify routine regularities of that language, of how it morphs words for purposes that serve certain tense, meaning, or nuanced functions. And these can be easily identified by a trained linguist with a language quite a way. It's interesting to note that when linguists have studied this phenomena of speaking in tongues, they don't find these structures in any of the examples. It's just not there. They do find other patterns, though, of more things that get repeated, certain syllables that get repeated after each other, but not in a way that seems to fit well with the way other types of repetitions would occur in an actual language. There's other things about language that we've noted in terms of the length of speech and various other things that would happen. And without going into too many details, let me just say this, that when linguists study the examples of speaking in tongues, they do not find that it contains any of the shapes or structures that are what we find in actual languages. Now, also, something else that linguists have noted is this, that every language comes from an area of the globe where the way they shape certain sounds in their mouth becomes uniquely different. So much so that you can actually tell the difference between one language and another, even if you don't know that language. For example, if you were to hear somebody speak Chinese and you can't speak or understand Chinese, and you hear them say enough in Chinese so that you get to the point where you kind of get this feel for what Chinese sounds like. And then you hear someone speak in Korean. Even though you have no clue what they're saying, you would begin to notice differences between how Korean sounds and how Chinese sounds, because there would be slight differences in the way they combine certain consonants, the way they actually say them. And this is part of where accents come from. And so there are these kinds of aspects to language. And something that has been noted by linguists who study speaking in tongues is that everybody who speaks in tongues, with rare exception, uses the exact same shapes of sounds as come in their own native tongue. You don't hear anything that would tell you it was a different language. This means that if a linguist were listening to a person speak English, and that linguist themselves were actually native to another, and they didn't know English, and they heard an English person speak in tongues, they wouldn't necessarily hear anything that, in terms of the way the syllables were sounded, that indicated to them that they were hearing anything other than in an English American accent. And so this is part of what the linguist would argue means that there's no other foreign language going on here. This is just nonsense gibberish of mixing up English sounds when you're an English speaker who's speaking in tongues. And in all honesty, I would have to agree with these linguists that that it isn't a language. It isn't a language at all. And there are many people who want to believe that. Now, I don't know why they believe it. I can't speak for them, but I get the impression sometimes that many times people believe this because when we can believe that something we're doing is really led of the Holy Spirit, that seems to be something that supernaturally confirms to us our faith. And to me, that tells me that a person's faith is rather weak, that they need some sort of confirmation. They need something to happen that proves to them that this is something unusual and comes from God, and there just is no other explanation, which is kind of sad when you stop to think about it, because when professional people like linguists study this stuff and they understand the structures and the makeup of a real language, then these people, the linguists who study this, know full well that this isn't a language, and it's often the people who are ignorant of or unaware of the nature of language and how it is we can actually understand a language and study language and look at differences between various languages and the way that they're formed and the way that all the cultural habits come about that develop a language and how they evolve. That when a person unaware of those things wants to speak in tongues and thinks they're doing something supernatural, they have no clue what it is that they're doing and how it proves that they're wrong, because they don't know those things. And if they did know those things, they would alter the way they speak in tongues, which explains why some of the people who do speak in tongues do develop some sort of a foreign accent. They do that because they know they have to. And or because it was cool when they started doing it. But now this might cause you to wonder something that I had said. Okay, so you're saying that this tongues is not really a real language, and yet you're also telling us that you do this, that you speak in tongues. Yeah, well, you see, here's where I'm talking about getting outside of the box. Many religious practices from other cultures had other purposes in mind in the spiritual practices they were involved in than what we in Western culture have. In Western culture, we tend to be pretty linear people. We don't like drugs. Well, we say we don't, but as a culture, we tend to repudiate it. We even have something called a war on drugs, where people are trying to take control of what you can do with your own consciousness. But we have we have in this culture a bias towards clear, crystal, logical thinking. And if anybody is doing anything that doesn't represent some clear, obvious behavior, then they're just wasting our time. I would like to suggest that speaking in tongues really had a completely different purpose. That we just called it tongues only because that was just the word that grabbed on. Well, it's a language, It's something that you vocatively express. And I discovered this, actually. It was a result of my study of psychology and my study of linguistics that actually caused me to start speaking in tongues. And here's the way I understood it. And I found it very, very meaningful and useful. Part of the reason why I was studying some of the emotional psychology was because my own upbringing, it was not a good childhood. And by the time I was a young adult, I was pretty much a destroyed person, very, very destroyed, very dysfunctional, a lot of forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And life was extremely difficult, and it was extremely hard for me to articulate the pain or even the problem or the sense of self, because some of the emotional abuse that I went through was at a time that was either pre-verbal or where I didn't have the words to talk about it. And I couldn't find the words to talk about it. It was difficult. And sometimes those words were hard to even focus on, even when I could find the words. And what I found was this, that there's something about being able to get what you're thinking and feeling off your chest, to express it, or even to just express it to God in prayer. Sometimes just talking to God, knowing that that He is conscious, is sometimes it's good to just know that I'm not the only one conscious of these thoughts and feelings. Um, Sometimes I'm not conscious of what my thoughts and feelings really are. So if I open my mouth and just let gibberish come out, honest gibberish, stuff that isn't really anything, but I'm saying this as a way of trying to find a way of expressing that for which I cannot find words. I found that for me, this was a very therapeutic experience. It was something whereby I was able to kind of, as it were, have that feeling of having gotten it off my chest, having expressed it, having finally shared something that is hard to share. And sometimes when it comes to personal difficulties and struggles and problems, trying to share with somebody else really exactly how you feel can be a frustrating experience, because you start saying it and you realize the words don't quite cut it, or even if they're trying to empathize with you, what they're mirroring back to you is like, that's not what I'm talking about. But but by doing this, I found that it was like getting it out into the air. It came out, and there it was. And I found that this helped me to somehow get on just the other side of these things that had been kept inside. That some of them I still have no idea how to talk about them or how to express them. But I did consider it gibberish. So for me, it was a way of using the vocative experience of language to express something I didn't know how to say, didn't know what to say. And yet there we go. I just said it, or let's pretend I just said it. Now, there's a sense in which that makes no sense at all, perhaps. Well, it doesn't have to make sense, but it can still be quite cathartic. We have a comment here, so let's see what we find. Viewer comment: sometimes gibberish comes out of my mouth when I'm just trying to release stress. Exactly. Uh, that is that is it. In a very real sense of what I'm talking about. So I don't think it's not a language. It's not a real language or a secret language or an angelic language or a foreign language I'd never learned. It's not something really xenoglossic, um, but it is something along that sort of line. Now, I find that that this was something that I found very, very useful. Now, sometimes this is a matter of just personality. For example, we find that many times the people who tend to claim that they speak in tongues by speaking a gifted language that they'd never learned, most of those people tend to be, very outgoing people. It's rarely that it's the introvert who claims to do that, although that does happen. We also find that that there are other personality traits that seem to be uh, associated with people who do this, and I think some of that has to do with the fact that, particularly if speaking in tongues is really just letting out nonsense and gibberish as a way of just getting it out there, whatever you're going to say. Um, that people who are less inhibited, people who are willing to take a risk, people who don't care what other people are going to think about them, are more apt to do that in a way where they're not worried about how silly it might seem. And isn't that interesting? Talking about how silly it might seem. Well, that's because, well, it isn't real speech, is it? And what are you saying? You know, which, oh, by the way, let me go back to that. Interpreting tongues. One of the things that the linguists have noted is that they cannot determine any real connection between something spoken in tongues and the interpretation given it, in terms of the time it takes to say it in tongues and the time it takes to interpret it. When a person is interpreting a tongue, there will be certain words they will repeat in their interpretation and emphasize that they consider to be thematic. And yet there will not be any similar used, repeated thematic expression necessarily in the tongue that can be attached to some form of speech that is recognized as a structure, and on and on it goes, so that it becomes an interesting study when you compare the tongue and the interpretation of tongues, which is another reason why linguists reject the idea, most of them, that there's anything truly supernatural going on here, that any real language is part of it. But in a sense, it is a way for the person to say something they don't know how to say. In a sense, it's also, I remember when I was studying karate, I learned to do something that was very helpful to me when I started when I was a young kid. We would lie down on the floor, just lie down on our backs, feet separated a little bit, maybe by 18 inches or so, and our arms kind of spread out. And our sensei would tell us to relax everything. And then he would ask us to like tighten our right hand, but leave everything else relaxed. It was amazing how difficult that was really to do. We'd find that we're tightening our left hand when we're really only trying to tighten our right hand. And the more we practiced this, we got better at it. We got to the point where we could deliberately tighten certain muscles without tightening other muscles. And the reason we did this was because in our style of karate, one of the things we were learning to do was how to throw punches and kicks loosely and then tightening certain areas of the body just at the moment of contact and immediately going back into a relaxed mode as part of the way the punch or the kick worked. And it was part of the way that style worked. And it's amazing how you can learn to do that, how difficult it can be at first, but you can eventually learn to do it. In a similar way, I found that I'm trying to find a way of talking about what I really think and what I'm really feeling when I don't really know what. So by doing this gibberish, I'm actually practicing internally opening up to what it is that I feel, opening up to what those emotions are, letting them rise to the surface where I can start to be aware of them. And I found that through this practice, I was actually getting more in touch with what those feelings were, enough so that I could now actually give them real articulation and really start to talk about them. And so that's why I say for me, it was a very therapeutic thing. You know what? If you're angry at somebody, that's one way of talking to them when they don't know what you're saying. Just kidding. But the point being is that thinking outside of the box. I don't know if this is entirely the way that it was understood by the early church or by any of the Native American Indians or the people from India and China. I don't know. But as I look at what I know about what these people did dynamically and linguistically, I get the impression that this was pretty much the basic concept of what was really going on, that they were really just vocatively letting it out and saying things because it was helpful in a way of transcending and getting beyond some of the barriers of what was hidden deep down inside ourselves, hard to always get at. We have other viewer comments. I sometimes let out gibberish when I'm trying to creep someone out. You're as devious as I am. That's awesome. I'll tell you, one of my favorite moments of tongue speaking was during our great revival that we had here on the place, and I can't remember, Joey came out with something that was a typical foreign expression that some people pretending to speak in tongues would let out, as if it somehow legitimizes their experience. I thought that was hilarious. Anyhow, if your comment with some flapping your lips and with your fingers and making gibberish sounds, yes, right, yeah, that'll scare the pants off of almost anybody. But I think that if we think about this in a way that it changes the box that we've seen it in, well, is it a real legitimate language or are they just making stuff up? You know, one of the things you got to realize is this: people do it. And after they've done it, a lot of people do it again. And I think it is definitely undeniable that there are a number of people, certainly not all, who in this practice of speaking in tongues do find that it does for them something they can't explain. And it does seem to do that for them. It even brings them to a sense of peace, quiet. I find that many times what I was able to do when I was doing this on a regular basis, don't do it that often anymore, is I could then sometimes spend as much as 5 to 10 minutes saying absolutely nothing and having a sense of just total placidness and peace going on inside of me. Nothing wanting to get out, nothing needing to get out, just enjoying existence and being there in a very peaceful, clear-minded mode. It helped me a great deal. But hey, I got there by instead of trying to accept the traditional way of having it explained or rejecting the traditional way of having it explained, I said, well, maybe this is something else entirely. And when I began experimenting with it, I found it to be very useful. So, I'd encourage you, uh, open up your mouth, let it out, just let it go. And, you don't have to make anything of it. You don't have to turn it into anything that makes sense. And you might find it really does help you get in touch with some things inside that have been wanting to get out for a long time. Things that might scare you, things that might trouble you, things that are troubling you more than you realize, and it might be helpful to get them out. Now, I also recognize that I'm saying this as a person who did have a childhood where there were a lot of scars in there, and so it's quite possible that the people who find this most useful, at least find it useful in a way that I did, would be people who've been through that very kind of past experience of events in their life that traumatized them and clamped them down and kept them from being able to be truly in touch with what they were thinking and feeling or going through. More viewer comments. Bob, there are many references in the New Testament writings about translating tongues and how they were a sign for the Jews. Do you really think that it was noise without content? I thought Paul discouraged noise without content when he talked about tongues. I don't know that he sometimes you got to be careful about the way it's translated into English. I don't get the impression that he was so much worried about noise without content, but that and don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying there isn't any content in it. I'm just saying it's not a language. If you're doing that to express something difficult to express, there's some content there. It's just not in the language. It's in the self. But he did say not to do it without an interpretation. Now, what's actually going on there, we don't know. That could have even been Paul's way of saying, look, is part of his argument of this isn't working in your church services, and they may have even known. We don't know. We don't know what's the backstory to this. We just know Paul's talking about it. I think it's entirely possible that these people knew that it was a private, meaningless gibberish. And so when he's telling them to get an interpretation, he's basically telling them, he's giving them an absurd requirement. Oh, okay, well, he can't do that. So I guess what he's telling us is to not do it in public then, that could have been what's going on there. I don't really know, but that's also a possibility. And, as to whether or not it was a sign to the Jews, there were various different signs that the Jews wanted. Culturally, that's where they were at. Who knows what they would make of it or why they needed that, or if that's even really a legitimate need. I don't know that it is, even if it was part of what they were doing and looking for. I didn't want to do it because as I was starting to prepare it, there were several references. I was going to take a look at each one. And I realized that was just dragging us through an awful lot of stuff here that wouldn't necessarily get easily connected. So I didn't do that. But maybe sometime in the future, I will take a look at that and see if there's something there in the text that it suggests to me may have been more of what it's going at. But one thing I have to say is that given the understanding that linguists have who have done the study of this, that tongues, at least as they exist today, isn't a real language. And if there was anything going on in that day that was legitimate or different, it was a different thing that isn't happening today. And if we don't have anything about it that we really know about or that is really describing it in detail, then we really don't know. And by the way, that does bring up another issue about interpreting the Bible. It is amazing to me how many absolute, authoritative, definite beliefs many Christians have based upon something the Bible talks about that the Bible never explains or uncovers wide enough for us to understand really what it's talking about. I mean, something say not one of the most obscure things would be, say, baptism for the dead. What's baptism for the dead? I have no clue what that's about. It's mentioned, but what are they doing? Nobody really knows. Now, Mormons think they know, and so they're about the only organization I'm aware of that on a regular basis is doing this, baptizing people, baptism for the dead. But we can't take these texts of Scripture and find something that's mentioned in a passing way that isn't really defined, and recognizing all the church history that it's gone through that has shaped it, reshaped it, talked about it traditionally in this way and talked about it traditionally in that way, and think that we have any clue about what was really going on behind the scenes. We really don't know. We just know that it ended up producing these words that get translated in this manner and have been understood in this fashion. That's that's not real strong stuff. Not to say that it can be just entirely dismissed for those reasons, but it's not very compelling. It's not very demanding of us. Anyhow, when we think about this issue, I found it for me. I remember when I was a teenager, about 18, 19. I had a friend, a good friend, who had turned charismatic, and he was just speaking in tongues a lot. And I got to tell you that he was somebody I found to be very, very genuine and authentic in his desire to connect with the love of God. And he took that far more seriously than other people I knew about our age at that time. And I do remember that it had an impact on me then. So I remember back then I tried doing it. Nothing. And that was because I was trying to connect with something that was going to bring it to me, give it to me, or supernaturally take over. And I suppose in my honesty, I wasn't interested in manufacturing that. And so it never came, But I do recall on one occasion when I was going through something extremely stressful, and I was in some ways beside myself. And I remember feeling that I should pray about it. And I opened up my mouth and out popped, 3 or 4 syllables that were just totally nonsense. And I remember that after doing that, it was like I felt satiated. I felt relieved. I felt like, it's what I wanted to say. I didn't even know what I'd said. Don't know what to make of it. I don't care. It certainly got me through that moment. But that may have also been later why I then came up with this idea that maybe this would do. And for me, it was a very therapeutic experience. Anyhow, it looks like we have one more comment coming up. Probably telling me, 5 more minutes. So we're not going to get into this authority thing today. I didn't know whether or not what I was going to say about tongues would cover it. But let's take a look at, in the last few minutes that exist here, take a look at some of the other gifts that we talk about. I think it's important for us to not over supernaturalize this. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to de-supernaturalize things because I'm saying, well, I don't believe in that stuff. I mean, I have no problem with God doing whatever it is he wants to do. What I have a problem with is people claiming that God is doing all sorts of stuff that it didn't really say he is doing. Just inventing stuff, particularly when they're doing that as a way of trying to demonstrate and prove that it really is real. If you have any need to prove that your faith is real, then it isn't. That's my feeling. And I've expressed this in the past that I recognize that my faith is a sense of risk in something that is very flimsy, and I'm completely comfortable with that. Very comfortable with that. I think it's important that when we take a look at these other gifts that we're maybe abusing a sense of expression. It is a gift that we can do things. It is in a sense something we can be grateful for, that each of us come to life bearing various different skills, abilities, interests, talents. And it's also true that sometimes when our lives take a turn in some way, that we then find new things emerging that had always been there but never were awakened until that moment. And there are many people who may have lived their lives where there was a certain amount of tension and stress, and they come to hear the gospel of our safety in Christ, of his embracing them and calling them to a place of recognizing how safe they are, how accepted they are, how loved they are, how they can turn away from the religions that they just don't need, and that there are just no issues between them and God, and that this issue of resolving all of those tensions has just gone away, and in Christ they are free. That for many people this can be the occasion of good news and the discovery of gifts inside of them, abilities and talents that they just never knew were there before. And so I think that in some ways we need to consider the possibility that this is also what's really being spoken of. And at the same time, God can do anything that he wants to. However, even in the text, the biblical text, it's important to pay attention to something. There are clusters of miracles asserted to have occurred around the time of Moses. A cluster of miracles asserted to have come around the time of Elisha and Elijah. There's a cluster of miracles we see around the time of Christ. We don't see that miracles were a constant claim of what was going on. However, I think it's important to realize that as far as I can see, that in the biblical text, I get the impression that the miracles that are alleged to have occurred don't really have anything to do with the people for whom they were a benefit. That these miracles took place to clarify the bringing about of the story of a Messiah who was promised to come, and in establishing that forthcoming gospel. And that's what they were for. And I don't think that these miracles, as we even read them in the text, were ever, from the text standpoint, ever intended to be, oh, see, you're real spiritual, and so God is just going to bless you with miracles. That isn't the concept that I see even in the biblical text, no matter what it is you're going to make of it. And so I think that this concept that I'm going to therefore have all of these gifts as a way of confirming the fact that I am spiritually alive and all that other stuff is just another example of that insecurity coming out of a faith that isn't really all that strong. Anyhow, well, I didn't know if I'd take up 20 minutes or so, but anyhow, there you have it. And by the way, that's just my personal opinion on it. You don't have to buy into it or whatever. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, great. If you find that somehow just expressing stuff like that, just letting it out is helpful to you without having to turn it into something unusual, supernatural, just something that's a little bit outside of the box from what you're doing, go ahead, give it a shot, see what happens for you. You might find yourself really helped by it. And if that's so, wonderful. Anyhow, so we'll see you next time. My name is Bob Greaves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. Thanks for listening.
Ladies and gentlemen, stick. Oh, sorry about that. Ladies and gentlemen, stick around. In just a moment, Dr. Michael W. Jones will be on stage with myself, Joey Livingston, and we will be speaking with lots of people on Google Hangouts. It's happening in about 10 minutes, so don't go away.